It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Brazilian labor unions organized another major general strike on Friday to protest the passage of draconian labor and pension reforms. The one-day strike is being felt mainly in Brazil's largest cities, Sao Paulo, and in the capital, Brasilia. But work stoppages are also taking place throughout the country. The labor law reform would allow employers to increase hours worked per week and reduce salaries, among many other things. Meanwhile, earlier this week, President Michel Temer himself was indicted on corruption charges. Here is what he had to say in his defense.
I was accused of passive corruption. Write it down. I will repeat the expression, passive corruption, at this point in life, without ever having received anything of value. I never saw money and did not participate in arrangements to commit crimes.
Joining us to discuss this from Brazil is Mike Fox. Mike is an independent journalist living in Florianopolis, Brazil. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, how successful was this general strike for the unions?
So it was less successful than the big general strike that was held on April 28th. On that one, literally, bus systems were shut down across the country, all banks, and 35 million people participated. This one, it still shut down bus transportation systems, for instance, right here in Florianopolis, but they're running about 4 or 5 hours out of the day, so it's kind of a partial strike that they're on. Some of the different banks are closed, not all of them. And so it feels like a weekend, but it definitely is not like what you had about a month and a half ago. Now, people are still out in the streets. You still have had massive marches. This morning, people shutting down the major roads and highways into the biggest cities, blocking the highways with fire and whatnot. And then big protests and marches, particularly, like you said, in Sao Paulo and Brasilia this evening. And so successful, absolutely. They had to put the pressure on at this point. With the labor reform coming up to a vote here in the next week or two. And so, but was it as big, was it as successful as what we saw, a couple months ago? No.
All right. So where are the pension and labor reforms? Where are they at? I know Congress was dealing with them.
So the labor reform, which has been really the big one that a lot of people have been talking about for the last just couple of months, it finally has been voted out of the committees. It was first voted out of the Finance Committee and then just recently out of the Constitutional Committee, although it was shot down in kind of in the Social Committee just a few weeks ago. So that brings it up. It had to be voted out of 2 committees. It's now going to the floor of the Senate where they have to vote on it. It's very likely that it will pass, and that is not good for workers at all.
And what are the implications of it being passed?
So what it's going to do, it's going to, it could eliminate the 8-hour workday. It's going to decrease lunch. Right now, workers have an hour to an hour and a half for lunch. It's going to decrease that down to a half an hour. And it's really going to touch over 100 points in the Brazilian labor code, kind of decreasing workers' rights. Now, what's interesting here, and one of the major pieces that workers and unions are most upset over, is it's going to allow bosses to directly negotiate with their workers, sidestepping unions. And what that means is obviously you're sidestepping collective bargaining rights, you're sidestepping the ability to negotiate as a collective. So right now, what is not in this labor reform is touching bonuses, is touching vacations, touching maternity care, but it's possible this could be opening the door to be able to do that down the road through these kind of more individual negotiations. It's really, the whole focus is trying to weaken labor, trying to weaken unions, and trying to lock this in for the coming years. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in the 2018 elections just next year, and so they're trying to lock this in the same way they did with the PEC, with the constitutional reform they did just late last year, in which they locked in a 20-year spending freeze, right? So that's the same idea, not good. The pension reform that you mentioned, that is also kind of on the docket. It's a little bit further out. It's the constitutional reform, and people are even more up against that than the labor reform. And so the Temer government has been really fighting hard to try and to get something passed. He wants to get something approved. So they've been kind of whittling away at their original proposals. We still don't have a date for that. I think they're kind of holding on to it to make sure that they actually have the number of votes to pass it, because for that one, since it's a constitutional reform, then it means they're going to have 2/3 majority, or 60%. So that's going to be harder for them to pass. Regardless, even this labor reform, it's not popular. But obviously, what we have in Congress, as I've mentioned before, it's the most conservative Congress in a long time, and there's getting a lot of lobby from the transportation businesses, the private sector, to really, really get this thing through and get it through as quickly as possible.
Right. So then, apart from the labor reforms and the pension reforms, the one thing that's on everyone's mind is these corruption charges that's been laid against Michel Temer. How serious are they, and do they have evidence that they're citing in terms of these allegations?
Shamini, this is the first time since the end of the dictatorship that a sitting Brazilian president has been brought up on been indicted, brought up on indictment charges by an attorney general. So this is a very big thing. It's not happened in decades, if ever, as far as I understand. So, and people are kind of taking it and trying to understand what this means and what's going to happen. So he gets brought up, it was sent to the Supreme Court, they pass it down to the lower house. Now that means the lower house, it's in the lower house's hands to decide if it wants to go forward on a trial. In this way, it's very similar to the trial against Dilma. The difference is, in this case, you have a lower house that's in cahoots with the Temer government. You have a lower house that's in alliance with Temer. Now, Temer, his approval rating is 7%. His image is just, it's tarnished, it's bad, it's sank pretty much as low as you can go. I think he's the lowest approval rating of any Brazilian president since 1989 is what I read. But at the same time, in the lower house, you have roughly something like 2/3 of the members of the lower house who themselves are under investigations for the corruption. And so they're not gonna just go ahead and vote for to move forward with the trial against Temer if they think that backlash can come back against them. So it's kind of like, you wash my back and I'll wash yours. So the chances of them actually approving this, of going forward, that's another question. Now they need 2/3 to actually approve the trial against him. What would happen if the lower house votes for this is that he would be suspended for 180 days, just like Dilma was suspended, and while the Supreme Court deliberates before they come out to a verdict. In the meantime, you'd have Rodrigo Maia, who's the head of the lower house. He would become the president. He's the son of Cesar Maia, as we've mentioned in the past, who's a longtime former Rio de Janeiro mayor. So that's kind of what's at play right now. Now, Temer is fighting as hard as he absolutely can not to go down. He also understands that the only people that can take Temer down right now is the Supreme Court itself, because he can't be tried for corruption and for bribery and other things on the lower courts while he's the president. He's immune from that. But if somehow he was, jettisoned from office, then he could be in jail next week, essentially. So this is a very complicated moment right now for Brazilian politics. You mentioned also about the proof that's behind it. The proof is pretty solid. So the Attorney General, Rodrigo Janot, who was put in there by Dilma a few years ago, this all comes back, and it goes back to those recordings, right? If you remember the recordings that we were talking about that were leaked 2 months ago between Temer and Joelce Batista, who was the head of the former largest Brazilian meatpacking exporter. So in those audio conversations that were leaked, Temer comes out supporting the continued payment of bribes to the former head of the lower house, Eduardo Cunha. Well, in those same audio tapes and in other ones that Joelce apparently had recorded, it was also heard, and that's where the proof is, that Temer received bribes from JBS. He received bribes from this meatpacking firm. Apparently these bribes were passed, the money actually, 500,000 reais was passed to a Temer aide. And this is part of a much larger package, apparently, over many years, that the Attorney General says that Temer receives something like 32 million reais over a longer period of time. So this is big. It's very big. Now, one thing that's important to remember also and understand, this is just one of several indictments that Janot, the Attorney General, is handing into the Supreme Court. So another one is actually up for, so there's two other ones that we can be expecting, obstruction of justice and something else about corruption. We can be expecting those in the coming days. So what does that mean? That means that even if Temer is able to squeak out of this one, even if they vote not to go forward on this indictment, he still has to kind of most likely he's still going to be facing two more indictments in the coming months. Temer is in bad ground. The only thing that's probably going to get him out of office is if the political elite decides that he just cannot stay, in which case then they might vote to take him out. But they want to continue these reforms. That brings it back to where we are right now. They want to continue this political moment. They want to continue the reforms. They want to continue the austerity. If it doesn't seem like that's going to happen under Temer, then they're going to take him out.
Right. So one of the reasons perhaps not more people turned out for the general strike might be people are so fed up in terms of the political system in the country, and all these charges. Perhaps they want a giant leap taken, which is a constitutional amendment to hold the next presidential elections sooner. But that requires an amendment, and if so, they can directly go to another presidential election. Where is that at, and is that still a possibility?
I mean, it's always a possibility. I don't see it very likely because, again, what you would have to do is convince the Congress that they want to vote for new elections. And that doesn't seem likely when the Congress is in the same bed as Temer and as in the political elite. Voting for new elections right now would mean that Lula and the left might have a possibility of actually winning and coming back and kicking, the Temer government, or at least the ideology of the Temer government, out of power. That's not something that the majority of people in this government right now want. And that's why it is an important thing that people need to be pushing for. It's an important thing that people are pushing for in the streets, and obviously the left and political movements and social movements, but it's not likely on a political scale.
Right. Now, earlier I mentioned that, of course, Brazil being riddled with corruption scandals and so on. If there were another election to take place right away, I understand that President Lula is a leading candidate for taking office right now, according to polls, which raises the question of where is his own charges. And I know he was in court. We reported on that. Where are the rulings on that?
Right. So we're waiting right now to hear from Sergio Moro. It could take. They say his own judgment can come out any day. So that means it could take hours, it could take days, and it could take weeks or months. It really depends on how quickly he moves. Usually he moves pretty fast, so people are kind of expecting to hear something on the Lula case fairly quickly. Now, if Lula is convicted of corruption, then he would be able to appeal, and that appeal could take, it could take a long time, but generally those appeals can take up to something like 340 days or something like that. So that puts us right into a place just a couple of months out next year from the 2018 elections. And I think that's all the more reason why we can expect to hear a verdict from Moro as quickly as possible, because if it is a conviction, then he's going to want to move this thing as quickly as possible to try and bar Lula from actually running for office. So that's kind of where that stands. What he's going to say, what Moro's going to come out with is anybody's guess. Now, obviously, if you talk to the left, social movements, the Workers' Party, they say there's no way that Lula is guilty. This is all based around this what they call a triplex. It's this apartment complex that he apparently was given as payoff in these bribes. And then, obviously, the Lula camp says there's no way that he was given this. It was always in the hands of Altbrecht and of the company that had it beforehand. and that they were interested for a little bit. Lula and his wife were interested in potentially purchasing it, but they didn't. And so that's where this all centers around. It's what's happening. Was it really given to Lula or was it not?
Right. Either way, it looks like it'll be 2018 before any serious changes could take place in Brazil.
Well, serious changes happen every single week, right? But serious changes on a political level in terms of the presidency, yeah, exactly. It's late 2018.
All right, Mike, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.